Okay, my clicker is working. Cool, excellent. All right, thanks everybody for coming to my session. My name is Les Peabody. Come from a little company in the south end of Boston called Genuine. I'm a Drupal developer. I've been there for about 5.5 years. And I'm extremely excited to actually have the opportunity here to talk to you today about this really cool technology that I stumbled across about a year ago. How you doing? So Docksal, the last local environment, totally ripped it off of Star Wars, obviously, right? And as I find out last night over beers and wings, it should be more likely titled Docksal, one of many other environments to do something similar. But just exposing you to this technology, I think, is really important, and especially if you're still operating off of something like a local LAMP stack. So let's get right into it. So a quick pulse of the audience and a show of hands. Who still runs a local LAMP stack for doing their development? Raise your hand. Oh, actually, I don't. Okay, so cool. All right. Who's familiar with containers, knows what they are? All right. Knows what Docker is, works with it? Awesome. Who's already familiar with Docksal and has used it before? All right. Excellent. And who works with Drupal? Awesome. All of my examples are going to pretty much run through Drupal, but I'm going to try and keep it more or less agnostic, because Docksal should really be usable for whatever you need to do locally, not just Drupal. What should you get out of this? By the end of this talk, you should have a pretty excellent understanding or good working understanding of how to leverage Docksal for doing your local development, and also possibly integrating it with your CI solution. You should know how to set up your system with Docksal, and you should have a good understanding and good guiding philosophy on how to actually use Docksal, set it up with your projects, use it with your projects, how to approach it, how to think about things. This is a pretty drastic change from how you think locally typically if you're just operating something like a local stack. So when I started looking for an alternative solution to using a local LAMP stack, I started off with, like most developers do, they have a set of requirements or beliefs that they need to adhere to, that their solution needs to adhere to. And really, there's 4 primary beliefs that I came up with. Get all philosophical. The first of those is onboarding any developer onto your project should take less than 30 minutes. I think oftentimes we see in development unnecessarily long onboarding periods. I think we've all been in this situation where we've tried bringing a developer onto a project, and for some reason it's taken hours, days, or maybe even up to a week sometimes to get them started on a project because something just isn't set up right locally on their system, something's just not working. We want to just get rid of that problem. That needs to not happen. And so a huge waste of time. It stinks. Like that. So let's make sure we keep our onboarding times to less than 30 minutes. A project should know how to define, or a project must define its own, should know how to set up its own environment. So the project dictates the environment. It's stored with the project, comes with the project. Wherever the project lives, the project tells, hey, I'm supposed to be set up this way. And it just does it. Pretty magical. Does that exist? Project must know how to run its own high-level operations. And what do I mean by that? A project should know how to set itself up. It should know how to compile front-end dependencies. It should know how to do a lot of things. But those are 2 pretty good examples. Developers need to not think about, how do I compile my node project, my front-end dependencies? How do I get the database from whatever I'm going to use to work locally? They need to not think about that. They need to know, I just need to run project setup and have it work. So we're looking for a framework that can do that for us. And I don't want to support it. I don't want to maintain it. I don't want to be developing my own Docker solution. I want to be using a solution that's out there already and it's well maintained. I don't want to have to think about it. I just want to use it. And that brought me to Docksal. I'd previously heard about it in a presentation, so it was on my radar. I knew it fit. I went out and looked at it, tried it, and I was blown away. So now I want to show every one of you and hopefully get everyone just as excited about it. So why Docksal? Well, first and foremost, for me, it's not a virtual machine. I've had virtual machines are okay. I've had decent experiences with them in the past where you go to set up a virtual machine, build it. I'm going to build a Linux box. It's going to have all these dependencies, and I'm going to run my project in that because I'm running Windows for some reason. But those things take a while to set up. And I know there are things out there like Vagrant, Drupal VM, where who's used Drupal VM? Just curious. Okay, I actually myself have not used Drupal VM. I've tried firing up Drupal VM on a project before and it just didn't work. And I just didn't think any more of it. So I want to avoid using virtual machines. Docksal is built around Docker, so it's container-based. So it's derived from images, and it's always representative of what's in code. Why is that important? Because if your environment is always representative of what's in code, that means it's consistent on everyone's systems. That's critical. Everybody should be running the same thing, right? That's what we should be shooting for. Comes with custom command support. That means to say that you can write project commands so that your project knows how to run itself. So getting back to that one of those primary beliefs, project knows how to run itself. Every project's going to be different. You need to be able to put in those customizable commands and processes. It has support for commonly used services. I find myself using the Varnish, Memcache, and Solar services a lot that Docksal provides. But it doesn't just stop there. Really, it's at the end of the day, it's just Docker. So any Docker image that's out there, you can just easily integrate it with your project. Just combine it. It comes with out-of-the-box CLI tools. So right immediately at the get-go, you have access to things like Drupal console, Drush, WP CLI, Node, NPM, NBM, Ruby, and many more. I think Yard. So you get all those right out of the box with no effort. And it's actively maintained and very well supported. Very active GitHub issue queue. It's maintained by FFW, which is I think a rather large digital agency. And they primarily work with Drupal. Really quick on why I like containers over instead of VMs. They're much more lightweight. VMs are huge, gigantic things versus containers, which are small, lightweight, and a natural extension of Linux operating system. So it's a core operating system functionality. Spinning up a container takes seconds versus a virtual machine, which takes minutes. And they're so much smaller, much more lightweight, much more nimble. This is all you need to do to set up Docksal. They've created this little curl command for you to run. And on Mac and Windows, after you run this command, you need to say finvm start, which will start up the Docker machine, essentially, and actually get Docker running on your system. Nice and easy. And then to start using it in your project, you just add this directory .docksal. That's it. Presentation over. Now I'm going to try and do demo. God help me. And actually demonstrate what that looks like. So, all right, cool. Nerd Summit Demo 1. What it's currently in there, it's nothing. Literally an empty directory is .idea because I have it open in PHP Storm. So let's set this project up for Docksal. There it is. I'm going to say fin. Now, fin is Docksal's command line tool. It's written entirely in Bash. So as far as systems go, it should be compatible with most Linux Unix systems. I haven't run into an issue where it's not yet. These are the commands that you have available for it. For the most part, I find myself using the project commands and the db command. And you say fin start to start your project. It's going to create a network volume. It's going to create a network. It's going to create a volume. It's going to mount your project into the proper containers. It's going to create your containers or your services, your Docksal services. It creates out of the box for you by default. No other configuration needed to get a database, a web server, and a CLI service, which contains all those tools previously mentioned. And that's it. It's up. It's running. It's available at nerdsummitdemo1.docksal. So if I go to nerdsummit1.docksal, oh dear, I get forbidden. Well, that's because Docksal expects your project to be mounted in directory doc root. Your document root should be doc root. So let's make that doc root directory. And let's just add an index.php file so it has something to output. Okay. There you go. So in order to get a working environment, all I had to do is add .docksal, have an index.php file, and it runs. It runs through a web server. We're not using the database. And it runs with PHP that's available in that CLI environment. Didn't have to install anything else on my local system. It's just Docksal. Didn't have to create a virtual host configuration for it in Apache. Ugh. I seem to have lost my mouse. There it is. Back to it. All right. So how do we actually make it useful to us? Well, any given project, you can add that in. You get that default database, you get that default web server, you get that CLI environment. How do you make it useful for your project? You need to start wrapping those custom commands into your project. And how do you make those? Where do you put them? In the .docksal/commands directory. Now, getting back into the philosophy and the belief of a project should know how to run itself, a project should know how to set itself up, we're going to create an init command. The notion of an init is a convention used by the Docksal maintainers, so I just sort of adopted it myself, which is you're just initializing your project. So the notion is any developer checks out your project, they have Docksal running on their system, set up on their system, they run fin init in their project root, in their project, and they're immediately automatically onboarded onto the project. And they can start coding, they can start writing features, they can start fixing bugs. Demo number 2. We're going to write the init script for our Drupal project. I write an init script, I'm going to say, show you something that I already wrote. Go back into PHP Storm, get to Nerd Summit 2. I've added this init script to the commands directory, and well, what does that do? Can everybody see this? Read it? I can like make this. Yeah, there we go. So what does it do? So it's going to run these commands. And all of these custom command files are actually bash scripts. Again, fin is maintained and written in bash, so I guess you could just technically change that up top to run it in another language if you wanted to get fancy with it. I wouldn't recommend it. I would just try and go straight bash if you can. But at any rate, it's going to run. This is how a project's initialized. Very basic example. So you run fin resetf, which will recreate your environment based off of the latest Docksal configuration in your project. So at any given time, you could add additional service to your project. You could change configuration slightly, and that configuration's imperative is reflected on everybody else's systems to make sure that everybody's operating in the same environment. critical. Reset will remove your existing containers and just recreate. We're going to run our composer install to get our project dependencies. We're going to copy any local settings files we need to where they need to be. And then we're going to install the cycle. That's a very basic init script, right? But you run that script, having just cloned the project for the first time, and your project will just set itself up. Nerd Summit Demo 2.
You have to change your, like you said before, that the sort of index.php had to be in doc root.
Yes.
I'm assuming project root is the Docksal project.
Yep.
So did you have to change that? What doc root is, or are they sitting side by side?
You're talking about in terms of the Drupal project?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is like Drupal by default, using Drupal Compose, it comes as web, right?
Right.
Right. So I can show you that really quick. And this gets into a slide that I'm going to get into in like 2 or 3 slides.
Oh, if you can cover it, that's fine.
Okay. All right, we'll just do that then. But that's good. That's thanks for bringing that up. Everyone keep that in the forefront of your brains. So we're in Nerd Summit 2. We're going to demo the script. We're going to say fininit. We're going to remove the existing containers, get rid of the network, get rid of the volume. We're going to recreate them. You get CLI, DB, Solar. You see some other ones being created, Memcache, Varnish. It's going to reconfigure the proxy, point the right project. Install composer dependencies, move files, set up local settings files if it needs to. Now we're finally installing the Drupal profile, the standard profile. Cool. That ran. The Nerd Summit Demo 2. Drupal site. That's pretty cool. Think of it as like, again, think of it from the perspective of somebody who hasn't been on the platform yet or who hasn't worked with the project yet. They say they just cloned this project for the first time. They ran init, and this is what they get. Nothing else. They don't have to think about anything else. That is such a nice feeling as a developer that you don't have to worry about going into your own Apache and being essentially a local systems administrator. I used to like doing that. I don't like doing it anymore. I'd rather get in, get out, and get my work done. So it just saves so much time. Moving onward. Extending and configuring Docksal. Now, in a lot of cases, the default Docksal setup is not going to be everything that you need. In fact, most of the time, it's probably not. So you need a way to customize it in your project. Docksal comes with that way. Comes with a way of doing that. Primarily, that's going to be done through the docksal.env, docksal.yaml files that are stored in the .docksal directory. Now, again, can you raise your hand again saying who's familiar with Docker? Okay, so Docker has this notion of Docker Compose, which is a gigantic YAML file that tells Docker how to create the environment. And Docksal sort of took that and created a default version of it that is more or less hidden from you. But you can override that by altering docksal.yaml and docksal.env. And Docksal just sort of stitches those changes into their default Docker Compose. And if you need to change anything, then you want to create a derived image. So if you want to alter, if you want to add additional command line tools to your project, you need to do that by extending the CLI image, the CLI service. You need to add to it. So sort of approach it from an object-oriented perspective where you have an inherited system. And Docker ships with that. So it makes it ideal. So it's an ideal working solution. All right, so demo 3. Overriding project images and extending images. I want to touch on your point on the web directory. It's going really quick. So we have docksal.env. And you'll notice this configuration value, docker root, you just set that and it sets the document root. That's what it uses. And we'll cover Docksal stack in a minute. What did I do with it? There it is. Okay, so there's really two ways to extend functionality in Docksal, service functionality in Docksal. The most recently supported or officially supported way to do it recently is to actually add a Docker file in the services CLI directory in the .docksal folder and rebuild the image there, rebuild what you need to be in the environment there. And this is great. So Docksal's default service, Docksal CLI, you say, okay, from that, add these things to it. That's all you got to do. It's impressive. It's just impressive how they put the system together and leverage Docker to make you having to do as little work as possible to add some powerful functionality. It's a Docker file. The other way of doing it, which is how I originally started doing it, and I no longer want to do it that way because it's just a pain, is actually building your own Docker images, pushing those images up to Docker Hub, and using those. You need to tell Docker, you need to tell Docksal to use that image instead. And the way that would be done, let me get to another project, is this. Let's say you did that. You created your own Docker image, your own Docksal image derived from Docksal's CLI image. And you say, instead of using their regular image, use this one that I've created. It lives on Docker Hub.
That one line 5 is?
Sorry?
That one line 5 is?
Yes. It says, this is the image that, as it exists, is specified on Docker Hub. I'm going to pull down this specific version of it on this specific tag. And that's pretty useful. If you find yourself on your projects at work or wherever, reusing the same image over and over again, rather than embed that Docker file in your project, it's really no longer project specific. If it's project specific, put it in that Docker file. If it's not, you probably want to build your own image and extend Docksal's service, Docksal's whatever service that you want to change, and include it as an image instead. This is from a maintenance perspective, because then if you change that image, I think at that point you've decided it's okay if other projects also get that updated piece of functionality that I've changed to, and you get more bang for the buck in terms of having, they don't have to update every single project that you have to use a new Docker file. Then we have stacks, and stacks are really cool. Stacks are pre-configured sets of services that Docksal can use by just specifying the Docksal stack that you want to use in your docksal.env file. Docksal ships with 2 stacks by default. It has their default stack, and it has the Acquia stack. Every project by default uses the default stack. That's your web, your DB, and your CLI service. You can opt to use Acquia stack. And it's called that because it more or less closely mirrors Acquia's production environment, which uses Memcache, Solr, and Varnish. And so I know in the past as a developer, I've been asked by a client, when I save this page, I need the cache to be completely destroyed for that page. Okay, cool. And if you happen to be going through Varnish, you have to make sure that locally you have a Varnish server, that you can test against. And just setting that up has always been a pain. So when I saw that it had the stack and it had this Varnish service, I freaked out. I was super happy. It's the little things that really drive me. And that was the Docksal stack configuration that I had set up before, that you saw before. So Docksal stack is Acquia. By default, that's not there. It's just going to use the default stack, and you're going to get your web, your DB, and your CLI service. It is there. update your environment. I already created them. But besides seeing the DB, CLI, and web lines, you're going to see Memcache, Varnish, and Solar. They're just there for you, ready to use. The Solar image comes with a single core that you can just plug into Search API and use the pre-configured settings there. Varnish, you don't have to do anything with Varnish. Although you do have to know how to look at. You have to know to look for one thing. And that is when you're running Nerd Summit 2.demo. That's great. You're not going through Varnish at this point, though. You're just hitting the webhead. They expose Varnish in the subdomain. So there are my Varnish headers. And if I want to look at, well, what does it look like if I don't go through Varnish? Helpful for debugging purposes. Varnish headers are gone. So you can look at both simultaneously. And that was a pretty cool feature of Docksal, and I greatly appreciate having both sides exposed at the same time. So there's the stacks. So I mean, through the course of working with something with Docksal, and you decide that you're going to have all these services, like for example, what Pantheon. I think Pantheon uses Redis as their accelerator, not Memcache. So there's no Pantheon stack, and I think it would be really cool to see something like that. So you'd want to build a stack with Redis in it. You can just grab the Redis image and include that with the stack. And when you ever say use Pantheon, on your project, you just get the Redis service. So that just really goes in, it really buys into Docksal's mantra of zero configuration, is what they've called it. Little configuration as possible to get as much bang for the buck as you can. Other notables. Share. I'm going to say FinShare. It leverages ngrok service to tunnel in from the internet directly to your local system and points directly to that host that you have on that project. So without any effort, there you go. Really helpful for working with clients or showing a colleague. You don't have to bring your laptop across the office to show someone. You just send them a link, and there it is. It's the latest feature you're working on. Witness me. All right. And the other one I wanted to mention, which I'm in the middle of integrating at this moment, is the CI agent. That is going to be documented very shortly. I think I saw in the 1.7 release notes that they're actually documenting this feature. The CI agent is a single Docker image, which can be used with services like Circle CI, Bitbucket pipelines that accept Docker images for running your builds. And by specifying a certain combination of environment variables, you can have a separate sandbox server to set up in the cloud somewhere. That you specify all the connection details in these environment variables. The CI agent knows to look for those environment variables in the service, the pipelines, whatever. And it will deploy, for those familiar with Pantheon's multi-dev system, it will create sandboxes for every single branch of your project. And that's incredibly useful for QA purposes. So when you're working on a feature and you have a feature branch, you push that feature branch up, Docksal, the CI agent will deploy that code to the sandbox environment and update that branch and bring it up to date with however you determine it should be set up, whether it's through installing an installation profile, synchronizing with a production database, whatever. The way to think about it is you're running Docksal, it's Docker. Running it locally or running it in CI is no different than running it locally and vice versa. The only difference is on CI, it's automatically running things like tests, your test commands, anything to verify the integrity of your build. You should be also running those things locally, but you don't necessarily have to be doing that. But that's the idea. You take your Docksal project, anywhere that's Docksal enabled, your project will just run. So quick recap. So using Docksal's philosophy, we see the potential for keeping onboarding times to be under 10 minutes. Ideally, I said 30 minutes in the beginning. Really, it should be 10. I don't know if that's too aggressive or not. Depends. I guess if you're downloading a 40 gigabyte database locally, you probably it's going to take longer than 10 or 30 minutes. We know how to set up Docksal. We know how to integrate it with our project, and we know how to approach extending our project with Docksal, with custom commands, so our project knows how to run itself, set itself up, and eliminate all entropy and errors generated from, but it works on my local. Everybody's running a consistent environment and everyone's happy. Some references, Docksal's main site, documentation for Docksal, their GitHub. I use their GitHub mostly for everything. It's because their issue queue is extremely active. The maintainers are very active there. They have a YouTube channel, which is fairly new. Thanks. Hope you thought that was cool. Questions?
So when you spin up your local site, you have a nice URL and everything. How does that work? Is it editing like your host file or like?
Yeah. So what Docksal does was it looks at your folder name, and it's based off the folder name. And it creates a URL safe name and just straps on .docksal to it. And there's they have a virtual host reverse proxy service that uses Nginx so that it knows where to route the requests to each project.
So, hey, I'm just as excited about this as you are, because it's really exactly.
I know. I'm so excited. It was like, oh.
Yeah. I'm on sort of the other side of this in part. Besides being a developer, I'm involved in the DevOps and the infrastructure. And so the question of getting developers is, okay, as we're switching to a containerized production environment, what's this look on my desktop? So how can you answer that? I was wondering if you have thought about or could speak about how you might take what's coming out of that Docksal environment and push it up to some other container environment. In our case,
like a production environment?
Yeah.
So theoretically, I thought about this. I haven't really tested it at all. But stop sharing that. Again, this is just a Docker compose that's stitching together ultimately, right? You'd say fin config show. This is the entire configuration that ultimately is compiled by Docksal and used to generate your environment. So you wouldn't necessarily want to run something like Docksal on a production system. You'd want that to be much more stable. If you run finrm in that environment, God help you. My production's gone. You can theoretically just take this and run it safely on your production system, get that fired up, and then not worry about it, I want to say. I'm not a Docker aficionado by any stretch of the imagination, but based on what I've read and how if I wanted to use Docksal in production, it's basically said just look at what gets output here and sort of stitch that into your production system. That's where I would start in the approach. Yep. Any other cues?
Stacks.
Yeah.
Can you create your own?
Yes, you can create your own stack. What would be the point of having stacks if you couldn't do that? So if you go to where Docksal gets installed by default, which is your home directory, there's a stacks folder there. These are all the stacks that come by default. They're derived from the default stack and Acquia, and they have this notion of static, which probably you should be using on your projects more so than not static, because when you have that static, using that static stack, then it doesn't change. It's using a specific sets of services. And if for some reason that service gets updated down the road, you're going to pull that in instead, and you don't necessarily want an upstream change to immediately affect your downstream environment. Just to see what that looks like. Stack Acquia.yaml. This is the Acquia stack file. We're going to use these things. This looks like Docker Compose because it is Docker Compose YAML format. It ultimately just stitches these together through some magical process. So if you were to like add something like Redis to this, I would just like copy and paste this. Solar, make it Redis. Maybe replace memcache, probably. Yeah, that's how you build a stack.
Does it get the name from the YAML files? Like with these, can you say on your docker.yaml, or your docksal.yaml file, you can say instead of saying Acquia, you say Acquia-static? Yeah,
in your docksal.env file, you say docksal stack equals Acquia. It's going to look for a file in here called stack dash and the name of the value that's specified, and that's what it's going to use.
So whatever you want to name your stack, you just paste stack dash
name. So if I in there, well, this live demo. I haven't tested this. And that the static should just work. I have no fear. I thought you were saying like my network went down. Projects, nerd limit demo 2. If this changes to use Acquia static, if I say fin up, what happens? Pulling varnish 3.0 stable manifest for Docksal varnish 3.0 stable not found. So I couldn't find that image on Docker Hub. So apparently their Acquia static file is out of date. But you did notice that it's what it tried to use. So that's how you would do it. Any other cues?
How would you write Composer? Composer.
Oh, excellent point. So, yeah, so Docksal CLI service does come with all those commands baked in. Composer, drush, they're all available. There's some shortcuts. So you have fin drush is a shortcut to accessing drush, fin Drupal, etc. But there's no shortcut for Composer. But in general, if you want to run a command in the CLI environment, you would just prefix it with exec, and that will execute the rest of the command in the CLI environment directly. So in my init script, you have fin exec composer install. So it's going to go into the container, execute composer install in there. One of the things that I've seen people do errantly is not prepend it with fin exec, and then they're actually running those commands on your host system. So it wasn't prepended with that. Again, this script is run on the host system. It's not run through the container.
Specifically to that point, I found it's better to use the exec because then you're using the same version of Composer that's inside the container.
Absolutely.
If you're doing Composer on your local machine, you may be running a different version of Composer. You end up messing up your composer.log file and stuff like that. There is also fin bash.
Yep.
So just drop you right into the Composer. You get a CLI command line, and then if you don't prefix anything with fin exec, you just drop right in. pragmatic. It's really
It's actually probably a better way to start working with Docksal, because you just get familiar with running commands, everything through the environment. But yeah,
You
absolutely.
still have to go into the doc where you want to run Drush. You can't go www.
It's true. Although as of Drush 9, I don't think you have to anymore.
Okay.
True. Yep. All sorts of commands in there.
It's going to have all kinds of stuff like that. The things that it will have is things like VIM.
Right. But they just, run Vim on your host system. But that's true. Like, what if you didn't want to have an editor on your system? What if you wanted everything through Docksal? That might be a bit extreme.
No, there was one time when I had to get out of the bare root and edit a file, a configuration file, network configuration, because I was behind a VPN.
Oh.
And that I had to install the inside of the
So this is actually an excellent point. Last summer, I had an engagement with a client, and because they were forced to use VPNs, it killed their access to local area connections, like running on their own system. So they couldn't actually access Docksal, even though it was running on their system. It was crazy and maddeningly annoying. So one thing to look at if you're going to be forced to use VPN is making sure that you can actually still run Docksal or virtual machines in general.
Yeah, in that case,
It's a good gotcha.
The VPN tool was grabbing addresses it shouldn't have grabbed, like 10.0.0.1, which Docksal uses, and saying, no, you can't read. I won't redirect that back to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real pain in the butt.
Yep, it is. Networking stinks.
What about Nano? Does it include that?
Probably not. It does.
Oh, now I know.
Awesome. Yeah. Are there any other questions? All right, thank you very much, everyone.